Meeting is being recorded. Okay, good evening to everyone. Hope you are all well. I do thank you for joining this lecture / share, whatever you want to call it, is about the philosophy of the Telshe Yeshiva. So I think you know that the Telshe Yeshiva, or the Tels Yeshiva, is the yeshiva I had the merit of learning in, the Chicago branch, which we're going to discuss. And it's obviously something of interest. It's something of interest. But we first really have to ask, what does it mean, a philosophy of a yeshiva? Because if I would take you to the yeshivot throughout the world, and you would walk in to a bet midrash, and yeah, some of them are going to look different than others. Some of them will have students with payas, and some of them not. Some will be clean shaven. Some would have a black yarmulke, some a kippah sruga. There are many types of yeshivot. We're blessed in this generation with an incredible amount of Torah study. But the question is, what does it mean, a philosophy of a yeshiva? Is there really a different philosophy? I mean, they're studying the words of Torah. And the truth is, when it comes to 95%, maybe even more, of the activities that are taking place in those wonderful institutions that we call yeshivot, there's no difference in philosophy. It would be very hard to go ahead and point, that's the philosophy of that specific yeshiva. However, it's the 5%. In other words, when you would go to a shiur, because remember, the average Talmud student in a yeshiva, especially if it is post-high school, he's spending most of the time not listening to a lecture or a shiur by his rebbe or the head of the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva. Most of the time, he's sitting in front of a Talmud with a chavrusa, discussing and analyzing, trying to understand what the text means and what the commentators mean and how to explain difficult passages. That's what they're doing most of the time. Yes, many of them do go perhaps an hour a day, some less, sometimes more, to hear a shiur, a lecture from the head of the yeshiva or from their rebbe. And that is perhaps one place we could detect a little bit of a philosophy. My feeling is, and this is more than a feeling, this is a reality, I believe, that the vast majority of yeshiva students would not really have the ability of identifying a different philosophy. If I turn to a Talmud student and I would ask him, I would turn to the 19-year-old and I would say, tell me the difference between the philosophy of your yeshiva, let's say the Baltimore Ner Yisrael Yeshiva, and the philosophy of the Tels Yeshiva. It's not really what they focus on. They focus on understanding the text of the Talmud. But fact is that that little bit, the shiur, and even more so if it's a yeshiva that has what is known as Musar Shmuzin, where they are taught, they're given perhaps once a week, perhaps twice a month, a lecture in ethics. That is when you could really detect, is there here a different philosophy? So I have always had an interest in trying to understand the philosophy, especially if it's the philosophy of the yeshiva I went to, right? I want to know what's their way of thinking, and in what areas do I identify a philosophy. So that's what our discussion is going to be about tonight. But as we start our journey of the Tels Yeshiva, remember, this we're going to see soon, Tels was a city in Lithuania. Obviously, it was pronounced by the Jews one way, and by the locals, it had its own pronunciation. And therefore, although it is spelled Telshe Yeshiva, and sometimes we would call it the Telshe Yeshiva, it's among the Jews, it was called the Tels Yeshiva. So you call someone who went through the Tels system a Telzer. Okay, so just to get a little bit of an idea of why it's called Tels or Telshe. But the truth is, the idea of talking about the philosophy of my yeshiva came to me about 2.5 years ago. 2.5 years ago, and I still remember the exact moment. And I'm going to go ahead, and for most of the lecture, I'm going to be sharing a screen with you. So I hope it's visible to all. I hope it's visible. And what you have here on the top picture, it's a picture that I took, as mentioned, 2.5 years ago. It was December 2018. When my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Avraham Chaim Levin, Zatzal, passed away. The bottom picture is his son, the current Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda. And I flew into Chicago to do Nichum Avelim, to go ahead and give comfort to the new head of the yeshiva, the current Rosh Yeshiva. I obviously merited to learn from the late Rosh Yeshiva, and I also had the privilege of being chavrusa with the current Rosh Yeshiva at some point. He's older than me, about 10 years older than me, but nevertheless, I had a little bit of a relationship with him. So I flew into Chicago late Motzei Shabbos. Sunday morning, I go for Shachris to the Beis Ovel, and Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Levin, a very impressive, very, very impressive individual, is sitting there. And after Shachris, but he sits on the floor as a mourner, and he talks a little bit about his father. And the phone rang, as happens often in a Shiva house. There are people who are visiting, at least prior to COVID. And then there are those who call, right? It's a form. You could do nichum avelum. You could comfort those who are in mourning through a phone call. So the phone was ringing, and Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda told his family members, listen, I'm not going to take phone calls now. I have people who traveled in to give the words of comfort. The phone calls could wait. But then someone gets back him and says it's a Rabbi Hollander, who was a senior rabbi in his 90s, who lived at the time in Israel, and he called. So he said, for Rabbi Hollander, I have to take the phone. So he's speaking to Rabbi Hollander, and I see Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda, the current Rosh Yeshiva, smiling, nodding his head. And then after about 5 minutes, he puts down the phone. And he's a very open person. In other words, sometimes I interact with people that they want to present themselves as great people. So you don't really get a real feeling of the individual, because at some point you pick up, there's a little bit of a show. Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda is completely honest about himself, meaning there's no show at all. You get his true essence, which obviously defines a person when they're completely comfortable with everything about themselves and their feelings, and it's all things that are impressive, you realize that their essence is a very inspiring one. So Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda puts down the phone, and he turns to me and others who are there. I just got an earful. Why did he get an earful? So as he's sharing why he got that earful, I realized that this is an historical moment for the Telshe Yeshiva. The conversation he had with Rabbi Hollander and what Rabbi Hollander was saying to him, Rabbi Hollander was an old Telzer, meaning he learned with the late Rosh Yeshiva. That conversation really fits in to the history of the Telshe Yeshiva. And that moment, I realized that I could really spell this out. Why is this moment historical? That's why I'm giving today this little talk, because I'm going to present a little bit of the philosophy of this very, very special institution, and why indeed that conversation, that phone call, was historical. Now, to talk about Telshe, the yeshiva tells, we have to place it geographically. Telshe is a city in Lithuania, on the western side of Lithuania. closer to the German border, which had an impact on the philosophy of the yeshiva. Tels focused a lot on order. Things have to be organized. We'll see soon who really introduced it, but there was a Tels flavor due to the fact that it was close to the Yekish, to the German yeshivot and philosophy. If you look on this picture here, I have here, okay, we're going to go ahead and draw a little bit. You see, let me go ahead and see if I could draw here. You see Vilna, here we go. You see Vilna here, Vilnius, Vilna. If you fly into Vilna, you might land up in Minsk. That's what we learned if you follow the news, okay? And Vilna. And here is Kaunas, Kovna. Okay, these are the city of Kovna. You've heard of the Slabotka Yeshiva, Vilna Kovna. And it forms a triangle with a town to the south called Alitus, which some of you might remember was where my grandfather, Rabbi Aaron Milevsky, was the rabbi. We travel to the north, okay, you travel to the north, you get to Panivej. Panivej was a town, and their yeshiva of Panivej moved to Bnei Brak, and there's a Panivej yeshiva. There are other significant cities that we're not going to go through, but right here is Telshe. This is where Tels is. Okay, Telshe, that's the city. It's right here. There was a Jewish presence there for many, many hundreds of years. It appears that at some point in, I think, the 1860s, 1870s, there was a fellow by the name of Yehuda Leib Gordon who wanted to introduce some more modern schools where they introduced secular studies and minimized the significance of Torah study. So there was a push back in town. And there was a push in the 1870s that we have to have here a strong yeshiva in the city of Tels if we want to go ahead and preserve, whoever's doing that, I don't appreciate that. If we want to go ahead and preserve our identity. And therefore, in the late 1870s, they begin the process of welcoming a yeshiva. Give me just 1 second, please. So late 1870s, they begin the process. This is the actual building of the yeshiva in the 1880s. And the city of Telshe welcomes Rabbi Eliezer Gordon. Rabbi Eliezer Gordon is the first significant head of the yeshiva in Tels. Well, we have to realize that in that period of time, what shaped Torah institutions were, number one, a yeshiva in a city called Volozhin. We've heard of the Volozhin yeshiva. It's considered the first great modern yeshiva, where historically yeshivot were really local. The local rabbi, what he would do is he would be learning with local kids. And if some of them develop and have the ability of making a contribution to the Jewish world, they would continue studying under the rabbi. Yeshivot were very local. In the beginning of the 19th century, you had broader yeshivot, like the yeshiva Volozhin, and it became really the father of the modern day yeshiva, where you have students from all corners of the world. Obviously, in Europe, it meant more within Europe itself. So the Volozhin yeshiva establishes this pattern of a new concept of a yeshiva. And unfortunately, towards the end of the 19th century, as Volozhin is declining, and then eventually it closes in 1892, there's room for a new yeshiva. And Tels, in some ways, took over that role of being the significant yeshiva. There were many other ones, but a very significant yeshiva in Lithuania. Now, another important individual that played a role in the shaping of the yeshivot from 1880 on was the philosophy of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the Musar movement. In other words, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter taught, and we've discussed this in the past, is that it's not enough to just sit and study Talmud to become that Jew that becomes better. If you just study Talmud, you might gain knowledge, but it doesn't really change you. And we have human flaws that we have to recognize, we have to address. The study of Musar is how you make the Adam HaMushlam. That's how you really create the perfect person. And therefore, the disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter believe that you must have Musar in the yeshiva, which includes time that's designated for the study not of Talmudic text, but rather works of ethics, like the Chovat Halvavot, Mesilat Yesharim, Shari Tshuva. There has to be works that you turn to that will guide you how to become that better person. Okay? So what's happening in the last decades of the 19th century is that when you have a yeshiva, yes, there's the study of Torah, but there are those that emphasize we need to bring Musar in. And in the 1890s, as Rabbi Eliezer Gordon is leading that yeshiva, there was a push by some, we'll see soon who, to bring in that Musar element. We should be study ethics. We should have a mashgiach, a person that works with the students. So he accommodated, in essence, the father of the first Rosh Yeshiva of the Telshe Yeshiva focused a lot on independence. He had this great trust of his students, and he allowed them to develop on their own. He did not come in with a strong agenda besides the desire that every student focus on limud HaTorah, on the study of Torah. And it appears that due to this level of flexibility he had, he allowed others to bring the Musar in. He perhaps was not a major fan of it, even though he had a relationship with Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. But nevertheless, it came into the yeshiva. Now, the person who really shaped the Telshe philosophy more than anyone else, and it's still sensed. In other words, I had the privilege of studying in a Telshe yeshiva in the 1980s. You still felt the presence of one individual, and his name was Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch. The Bloch family and Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib is the one we really need to know to appreciate Telshe. When Rabbi Gordon became Rosh Yeshiva in 1881, within a few short years, he sensed that he needs others to take over the role of teaching lower classes. Meaning, although the historical yeshiva was one that there was one head and one teacher, Telshe recognized that we're growing, we need more teachers. So he brought in his son-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch. Rabbi Bloch was in his 20s. He was recognized as brilliant. He was recognized as a great scholar. He was extremely organized as a person, demanded that Torah be honored, and he started shaping the Telshe Yeshiva already as a young man in his 20s. He started giving a shir there in the mid-1880s. And there was already an imprint of Rabbi Bloch. He's in his 20s. His father-in-law is much older than him. He's having a significant impact on the direction of the yeshiva. He introduces a mashgiach. He is the one that introduces the idea that you have to have machlokot, they were called shiurim. In other words, when you come to the yeshiva, you would be tested. If your knowledge of Talmud was not great, you would be in a lower class. And after six zmanim, or after a year and a half, you would be upgraded to the next shiur. And then after that, to the next one. And the idea of placing order based on the tools of the student did not exist in other yeshivot. In other yeshivot, you would go to the main shiur, even if you had no background at all and you would have no idea what they were discussing. You just came in. Not in Telshe. in Tels, they would assess you and they would place you in a specific machlaka. This was really introduced by Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch. Now, as he introduced the Musar into the yeshiva, there were many students who were not happy with it. They felt it's taking away from their learning. We don't need someone to tell us to come on time or to analyze or assess what we are doing. And it created great friction in the yeshiva, a big machlokes in essence. And Rabbi Bloch eventually left the Tels yeshiva. I think this was in 1902. And he left. He became a rabbi in a different town, and he finished temporarily his relationship with the Tels yeshiva. The Tels yeshiva continued growing, but it started struggling, and then it was struggling financially. So in 1910, the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Gordon, recognized as a Gaon, he was recognized as one of the greatest rabbinic authorities in Europe, and especially in Lithuania. He had no choice but to do fundraising in London, England in 1910. And there are all kinds of stories of his interactions there. These are not short trips, but were lengthy ones and draining ones. And unfortunately, he passed away in London in 1910 and never returned to Tels. There was a void, and obviously the one chosen that they brought back was Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch. So he returns to the Tels yeshiva, and now it was his yeshiva in 1910. And he shaped it the way he desired. And if there were members of the staff that did not see eye to eye in his way of thinking or in his approach to develop students, the member of the staff would have to leave. It became Rabbi Bloch's yeshiva, and there was a Tels approach as a result. The idea that within the Bloch family, they say that family members would never see him without his jacket and tie. He walked around always in a very respectful way, because he believed if I'm studying Torah, I represent Torah, I have to honor myself because I represent something far greater than me. This was Tels, the idea of Tiferes. Things have to be done in a very glorified way to inspire self and to inspire others. Now, what's really interesting for me is the fact I have always been taught that there was a Rabbi Yisrael Salanter who introduced Musar, and there were yeshivos that followed the Musar, each one in their own way. And then there was the Tels approach to Musar, which was a bit different. But as I analyzed it a little bit more, I have a feeling that Tels, the way of thinking in Tels, and remember, we're talking about a philosophy of the yeshiva. A philosophy of the yeshiva is not going to be assessed by the 85, 90% of the time that the students are just learning Talmud. It's going to be assessed by what the lectures are about, the Musar Shmuzen, what they are about. And we're going to read into them and try to understand the way of thinking of the one giving them. And from the little bit I know from Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch's thinking, he was not in any way a continuation of the Musar schools. He had his own unique way. He was different. And just as you would not say that Dr. Pepper is a type of Coca-Cola, even though they're similar, they're both sodas, it's hard to say that the Tels approach was really a Musar approach that was the byproduct of the thinking of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. I really don't feel that. And I'll tell you why. You know, when it comes to our practice of Judaism, there are those that focus on the why, and there are those that focus on the what. We'll start with the why. In other words, if I am told that I'm supposed to learn Torah and I'm supposed to do mitzvos, and I ask why, and I'm told it has an impact in the spiritual realm, And I ask, is there any text that explains how me doing good deeds has an impact in the spiritual realm? And the answer is going to be yes. You're interested? There's mysticism. And I'll start giving you the works of the Zohar, of the Arizal, of the Maharal of Prague, of Rabbi Yosef Chaim, of Moshe Chaim Lutzato. I'll give you Hasidic thinkers. These are ones that focus on the why. Now, some people are inspired by the why, that if they sit and learn that when you go ahead and make a bracha and you have in mind that you are grateful to the Almighty for this food, you're having an impact in the spiritual realm. And they'll describe to you the different worlds, that it's going to impact the word of Atzilut, of Bria, of Yitzira, of Asiyah. It's going to have an impact in all the spiritual realms. Some people get uplifted from it, and it works for them, and it talks to them, and they study mysticism, right? And even I myself, when I started my rabbinate 24 years ago, one of my first classes was on the works of Moshe Chaim Lutzato, Derech Hashem. I don't do that now as a class, but these are things that talk to many people. Why? But then there are those who focus on the what. The what. And there are two schools. They are very different schools, but they're both what schools. One of them is the Musar school. In other words, if you would turn to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and ask him why, he would say, why? God said so. You should focus on what. What do I need to do? You need to become a better person, so study Musar. You need to know how to practice your Judaism and how to be honest in the marketplace, so open a Shulchan Aruch, learn the laws of commerce and Choshen Mishpat. Focus on the what, or as they would say in Yiddish, nicht far vos, but rather vos. Focus on what you should be doing, not why. So that's one school. Another such school is known as the Brisker school. The Brisker school doesn't like focusing on why we do things. It's just let's figure out how to do it to the best of our ability with all the chumras, and that is what you should be focused on. Now, clearly, Reb Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, he was called the Maharil Bloch in Telshe, focuses on the why. There's an element of mysticism in his works, on the impact in the spiritual realms. That was the old Telshe of thinking. Now, it's fascinating that in Telshe, while in other yeshivot, there's a Musar shmuz, in Telshe, we didn't have a Musar shmuz. You know what we would have twice a month? It was called a shiur da'as, a lecture in das, in mindfulness, in knowledge, a lecture in knowledge. So the works, if you look carefully here, the works of our master, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, were published as the shiurei da'as. This is quite indicative of the fact that it's knowledge, it's understanding why we do it. It's very mystical. It's not explaining to you the system of mysticism, but it's telling you why you should do things based on mysticism. That was the old approach. So if I would have had the privilege, right, of being in Telshe Yeshiva from 1910 to 1929, that's what I would hear. And by the way, he would quote often from the Tanya. And those of you who know a little bit about Chabad has had a major influence on the Jewish world. And their go-to text when it comes to understanding the mystical Kabbalistic system is the work of Tanya. Traditional yeshivot do not learn Tanya. But Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib, Maharil Bloch, would quote the Tanya. And I did an interesting count. I looked at at the Shiurei Das, and I noticed that he quotes the Tanya more than Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, a clear indication that he was in some ways closer to Hasidic thought than to the Musar yeshivos. So this is something that was for me quite fascinating, and will progress with the history of the yeshiva to sense if that's something that remained or not. Now, by the way, it is no coincidence that Telshe Yeshiva of those years of the 1910, 1920, up until 1930, had a connection with Lubavitch a little bit. For example, if you live here in Toronto, you've heard of the name of Rabbi Shochet. There's several Rabbi Shochets. This Rabbi Shochet who passed away, I think, in 1974, Yehuda Dov or Dov Yehuda Shochet, the father of Rabbi Shochet, who works here and of a very well-respected family. Rabbi Shochet learned and was one of the closest disciples of Rabbi Bloch. He eventually joined Lubavitch. So although for some it would appear to be skipping from a traditional yeshiva to Lubavitch, but the fact is that the yeshiva of Tels, valued this text, spoke in that language, so it's not a major leap. And Tanya was studied in the Tels Yeshiva in the 1930s. And there are I have more information that really indicates that it was a way of thinking that was very, very close to the mysticism and the meaning that Hasidus gave. Now, when I learned in Yeshiva, I think the first and the most common Dvar Torah that we would hear from Maharil, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, was the following Dvar Torah. We heard it many, many times, and that's why I remember it. So before we read these verses are verses that appear in Parashat Tetzaveh, where the Torah describes what these artisans need to do to create the garments for the Kohen Gadol. And the Torah tells us, right? What does the Torah tells us? Ve'asita bigdei kodesh le'aron achicha. And these should be lechavod u'letifaret. You, Moshe Rabbeinu, guide those who are making the holy garments for Aharon, and they should be lechavod, for honor, and for tiferes and glory. Okay? And then we are told, Ve'ata tedaber el kol chachmei lev. Now speak to these wise people that they should make the bigdei Aharon, but here the Torah switches it. Not lechavod u'letifaret, but lekacho lechahanoli. That those who make the garments should make them to sanctify Aaron and to make him and to designate him as a Kohen for me. So there's a shift, because originally it says that the garments are for kavod and tifaret. And then we are told, lekacho lechanoli. Which one is it? So the story we were told is as follows. After World War I, things were coming together in Lithuania, which was under the control of the Russians at the time. And yeshivot were coming back together. And in the local newspapers that were circulating throughout Lithuania, there was some big news that a yeshiva in the city of Slabotka has started again after the war with 13 students. And it was a major celebration because their return to the yeshiva in Slabotka after the war is an indication of a return to norm after the war in Lithuania. And therefore, it was big news. It seems like that they had those who are working on PR, working on the behalf of the yeshiva, and it was publicized in all the newspapers. In Tels, there were those who were very disturbed, because while this small yeshiva in Slabotka got all the publicity, in Tels, they were learning throughout the years of the war. They had an operating yeshiva, and they were larger and more significant and were doing far more, and that small institution in Slabotka was getting all the coverage. So it bothered them, and they believe that the heads of the yeshiva need to focus more on publicity. So Rabbi Bloch gathered the students on Parashat Tetzaveh, and he asked the following question. Why is it that these garments that do bring kavod and tifaret, as the Torah tells us, Why, when the wise men, craftsmen were making these garments, they were told that they should make them to sanctify and to charge Aaron as a Kohen? Why is the kavod and tifaret not mentioned when those making it were half the things in mind? So Rabbi Bloch said, you should know. True that sometimes we do things and it's for kavod and tifaret, but if you're going to go ahead and emphasize on it, if you're going to put your effort into the honor and to the glory, it's no longer going to be for the sake of heaven. You have to be careful that when you do things, your main focus needs to be for sanctification, to serve God. True that there are results that cause kavod and tifaret. There are results that bring forth honor and glory. That shouldn't be your goal on why you do things and why you make things and why you serve God. He used it to explain this verse that these individuals, these chachmei lev, who while making it need to have intention, their intention should not be for things that are external. But he was giving a message for the yeshiva itself. The yeshiva itself, you need to know, we do not focus here on publicity. We focus on growing, on studying Torah, on developing our character, being kind to one another, creating a Torah institution. The glory comes on its own. It's not a focus here in Tels. That's what Rabbi Bloch said. Now, Rabbi Bloch's influence on Europe, it was a very popular yeshiva. And they had hundreds of students there, and they had to reject many students every year. They had a quota from every town how many students could come. And sometimes students would claim they're from a different town to get into the yeshiva. You had to come with a letter from your local rabbi that you're worthy of coming to a yeshiva. It was one of the great yeshivot in Europe in the up until the war, in essence. Now, in 1929, Rabbi Bloch passes away, and he has three sons who really take over the leadership of the yeshiva. There are others, okay? One son, the one in the middle, was not the oldest, was Reb Avram Yitzchak Bloch. He became the Rosh Yeshiva. He was young at the time, extremely well respected. His older brother, Reb Zalman, who's here, he became more of an administrator, mashkiach. And then he had a son by the name of Eliyahu Meir. Rabbi Eliyahu Meir got married and left Tels and was a businessman in the city of Memel. He was a businessman who studied Torah, was extremely careful in his practice of Torah mitzvos. He gave shiurim to balabatim, but he was a businessman. At some point, his father called him back to the yeshiva. And in 1929, as his father dies, he played a role in leadership. This is Rabbi Eli Meir Bloch. In the years of Rabbi Avram Yitzchak, what I have here, for example, is a telegram sent by Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Bloch in 1933 to a student. The student was a German student who was trying to get his PhD in a German university. Obviously, by Hitler coming to power, he was no longer able to continue his studies in Germany, so he applied in the spring of 1933 to Tels, and he got an acceptance telegram that Yavo, Yachol Lavo. Now, this rabbi, this was Hillel Manis, was this student. My grandfather, my mother's father, and he gets a stamp of approval to go ahead and make his way to the yeshiva in 1933. It's led by Rabbi Avram Yitzchak. My grandfather had many, many stories about Tels during those days, very fascinating ones. But as things go in Europe, in 1940, the Russians retook Lithuania. They had independence for some time, and then it was retaken by the Russians. The yeshiva was in crisis mode. My grandfather was in crisis mode. But although there was a crisis financially, there was no complete panic. And I'm going to quote you a little bit here from what my grandfather wrote about what's taking place in early 1941 in Telshe. And my grandfather writes that a few Platim, like a few refugees, come to Telshe, and the yeshiva tried to help them. But my grandfather wrote that it seems to me there was no deep concern or compassion for their fate. In other words, as they interacted with these refugees, in essence, they felt, okay, refugees. In general, my grandfather writes, there was a complacency in Lite, like Lithuania, no urgency, meaning as my grandfather in early 1941 is in panic mode, running to Kovna, trying to figure out a way to get out of Europe, in Telshe, things were more relaxed. The mentality was, we are citizens of a free country. What do we have to fear? Now, this attitude, my grandfather continues, manifested itself by the following answer. Harav Weinberg, the Sridei, a great rabbi. He was in Telshe because he was traveling from Berlin to Switzerland. So he turned to the Hanhola, he turned to the administration of the yeshiva, and he asked them in Yiddish, spürt nicht as der Boden brennt unter eure Füße? Are you not worried that the ground is burning under your feet? Right? Was schweigst du? In other words, why are you silent? It bothered Rabbi Weinberg that while everyone else in Europe was doing their part to try to get out, in Telshe they were relaxed. And they answered, the Hanola answered, Mir in Telshe, we in Telshe, laufen nit stamazoy. We don't just run away. Mir gein mit tiferes. In other words, since the philosophy in Telshe is that we represent the honor of Torah, we're not just going to run away like refugees and be in a mode of begging. We're going to wait and we're going to leave in a glorified way. It's interesting that when my grandfather would talk about Telshe, there was only one time I would see him getting angry. And that is when he would share with this story. And he would get really mad because he would revisit those moments of 1941 where he felt they should have been in panic mode and they weren't. It bothered my grandfather. Now, I'm not judging anyone, but no one could predict what happened. And let me tell you what happened, that in July 1941, the Nazis moved in. They tortured the locals. And on the 20th of Tammuz, they wiped out the community. They killed the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yitzchak Bloch, Rabbi Zalman Bloch. The list is long of who they killed. And the reason I know the date is because on the 20th of Tammuz in Telshe, every year we had slichos. We had special prayers to commemorate the events of 1941 in Telshe, and a special Shirei Das. We commemorated it. It was an incredible experience, just for the record, that you could go ahead and relive a specific date when the yeshiva that you represent their continuity was wiped off the map. In 1940, really, the yeshiva had to officially close its doors, even though the students still stayed in town because of the Russian government. And Rabbi Elimeir Bloch, the son of Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch, the one who was a businessman, who returned to the yeshiva, he was given the job in 1940 to take out the Sefer Torah from the Aron Kodesh as the yeshiva was going in exile. And he stood there in front of the Aron Kodesh with the students there, and he said the following, and there's a record. He said, God Almighty, this is the third time that I take out the Sefer Torah from this Aron Kodesh. Once was during a fire in, I think, 1905 around. And I merited to bring it back. I was the one that put it back into the Aron Kodesh. The second time was after World War I, where we took it out for a time. We had to leave the Bet Midrash, and I had the privilege of returning this Sefer Torah into the Aron Kodesh, which symbolizes a renewal, a revival. I turn to you, God Almighty. This is what he's saying in 1940. I pray to you, God Almighty, that I could return again a Sefer Torah to an Aron Kodesh in the Telshe Yeshiva. Now, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch in 1940 is there. In 1940, Rabbi Bloch is recognizing the challenge the yeshiva is having there, and he went with a brother-in-law, Rabbi Katz, to the United States of America with perhaps creating a plan of moving the yeshiva in 1940 to the United States. And although all contact broke off in 1941, Rabbi Bloch opened the yeshiva, a Telshe yeshiva in Cleveland in 1941, in the living room of a Feigenbaum family. And eventually they purchased the building. And yes, he put in a Sefer Torah. He was able to return it. But after losing many, many children, only one of his children survived. He lost his wife. They were all killed brutally by the Nazis. He lost everything. And his whole mission afterwards turned to rebuilding Tels. 24 hours a day was his whole essence, Rabbi Bloch. And my experience in yeshiva was always hearing about Rabbi Bloch, because the two heads of the yeshiva I went to, which we'll discuss soon, were students who were very, very close to Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch. Now, Rabbi Bloch was independent. He was different than his brother and different than his father. And to give you a little bit of a flavor about his philosophy, number one, Tels was not known as a Zionist yeshiva. Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch, on the other hand, the one who opened the yeshiva in Cleveland, was a proud member of Agudas Yisrael, but at the same time saw great value in the Jewish state. So, for example, in 1954, when there was the 6th anniversary celebration, think about it, 6, at least for me, it's amazing, of Yom Ha'atzmaut, which took place in Cleveland. So the people who were involved in the program, one of them was the wife of Rabbi Gifter, who was a Rosh Yeshiva there. But one of the speakers of the program was right here, looking ahead with religious Zionism, who was a speaker at a Yom Ha'atzmaut event of 1954 in Cleveland, Ohio, Rabbi Eli Meir Bloch of the Agudas Yisrael. He was, they would call him in Telshe Tzioni sometimes, but that was Rabbi Bloch, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch. And it's something I even heard from my mother. My mother remembers, by the way, marching at this event. She told me she was 8 years old, and she recalls the Yom Ha'atzmaut event of Cleveland, Ohio of 1954. So this was a different type. He was an independent. And that's the history there. Now, I mention here my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Avram Chaim Levin Zatzal. He passed away 2.5 years ago. And I've talked a lot with Rabbi Levin over the years. He was a true Talmud of Rabbi Eli Meir Bloch, who passed away in 1955. And Rabbi Levin, I would talk to him about Zionism and all kind of issues. He was basically, Rabbi Levin's goal was to emulate his master. He was knowledgeable in all areas of thought that his master taught, and he was a true Talmud. And the other Rosh Yeshiva I had was Rabbi Keller. Also had a very close relationship with Rabbi Keller. Rabbi Keller, in some ways, was more similar to Rabbi Bloch Sr., Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib. He would give Shir Das. He was more in tune with the mysticism, less of a Zionist. So it was interesting in the yeshiva itself to see how the history of the yeshiva could be present in two heads of the yeshiva, that each one represents a different philosophy that originated, that has roots in the Tels Yeshiva. Okay, now, there were many traditions that lived on in the Tels Yeshiva that they had in Europe. In other words, in Tels, they always had groups of students that were in charge of specific matters. So, for example, if the yeshiva, they didn't have a dormitory. The boys were sleeping in houses. So the yeshiva wanted to be sure that the boys were in conditions that were dignified. So they had a vad, right? They had a group of students who were in charge of the me'onot, of the dwelling places. They had a group of students who were in charge of the food. In other words, it was part of communal work within the yeshiva that was expected. They had what was known as avad b'nei hayeshiva. This was a Tels tradition. So this is a picture, obviously, that's about 100 years old. And, well, it's actually from Tafresh Pei Gimel. So it is 98 years old, this picture. And here, we would walk into the Beis Medrash at the end, every 6 months, and there would be a sign in the yeshiva of Telshe Yeshiva Chicago. Now, just to mention, the Tels Yeshiva Chicago opened in 1960. It was a branch of Cleveland, and therefore I mentioned that my heads of the yeshiva came from Cleveland. In some ways, and obviously I'm biased, it became in some ways the more significant Tels Yeshiva because of Rabbi Levin and him sticking to all the traditions of the Tels and of the Bloch family. But for example, here in Yeshiva's Tels of Chicago, there was a little sign that would be put up that Elu, these individuals, these students, are for the members of the Vad B'nai Yeshiva for summer of 1989. So you have the names, Avram Adler, Elio Meir Keller. It's no coincidence that there are many Telsers who were named after Rabbi Elio Meir Bloch due to his influence and impact. So Rabbi Keller had his son, Elio Meir. And if you see here the third name, I don't know if you're able to read it or not, and then two others. These were the members of the Vad B'nai Yeshivas. There were traditions that we always felt. And there was something great about it, that we felt a connection to the past due to these traditions that we keep alive. Now, I started off that really what inspired me for this discussion was a phone call that the new Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Levin, was on the phone with an old Telzer. And what this old Telzer was telling him was, you should know, Reb Shmuel Yehuda, I understand that you learned in Brisk, but you have the responsibility of keeping the Tels tradition alive. In other words, it is very common that North American right-wing yeshivot send students to study in Israel, and specifically in the Brisk yeshivot. Brisk, what is Brisk? So there was a great rabbi in the city of Brisk who landed up in Israel during World War II. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik from the Soloveitchik family, obviously brilliant. He was extremely strict, and he had his own system of analysis of text, which is known as the Brisker approach, which we could discuss some other time. Now, being that talented students in North America landed up in Brisk, Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Levin, the current Rosh Yeshiva of Tels, in many ways was more influenced from Brisk and their system of not focusing on why, but on what's, was suddenly taking over a yeshiva that had a very different philosophy. And it was a concern of an old-timer that if of a well-respected individual comes from a different school into the Tels school, will he really be able to preserve the old Tels Mahalach, the old Tels approach? So that was the historical phone call. And he smiled, and obviously he was aware of the struggle. And I have no doubt, I haven't been back a long time, that he's able to balance the two. He's a very talented individual. But for me sitting there and hearing about that phone conversation, it was a phone conversation about a direction of an institution that has been around since 1880, that has had these small shifts. And here there's a discussion about a shift, an historical shift. Is the yeshiva going to go more in a direction of a brisk than a tells? That's a valid question. So I felt that it's historical. It was interesting to me. And that's what inspired me to share a little bit about a wonderful institution that has inspired many, that's extremely special and unique. Tels was one of the first, by the way, that brought into yeshivot secular studies for high school already in Europe, which was not the norm. It was an institution that really did good for the Jewish world. And I hope I was able to share something that was at least a little bit of interest to everyone here. So I thank you again. Thank you for our sponsors. And I thank you for listening. And I thank you for joining. And hopefully we could continue our studies. Good evening to all.
Thank you.